Hello, welcome again to another edition of Matters of the Heart, brought to you by Haverhill Community Television and Pentucket Medical Cardiology. I'm Seth Belazarian, a cardiologist with PMA, and I'm here with my associate, Dr. Sunny Srivastava, to talk about a topic that's really very interesting and frequently brought up by my patients in a conversation about what they can best do to help with their cholesterol. We have talked on previous editions of this program on medications that we use, which are excellent, called the statin medications, that lower cholesterol in a very good way of 30 to 40%. But there are some other ways that are very useful that can add on to that amount of cholesterol lowering, and these are through dietary means. And many of the topics that come up are very difficult to explain in a short time during an office visit, and I'm very excited about this allotted time to talk about the topic Dr. Srivastava has prepared for us, and that's the topic of cooking for lower cholesterol. So I'm going to turn it over to him to educate me about the impact of heart disease, cholesterol, and what fats we eat. So take it away.
Thank you. Sure. What led me to want to talk about this was, I think, just what you alluded to, that every day I get questions about dietary things, and we're often not well equipped in a quick office visit to really get into detail about this. So I thought this might be a useful medium to do this in, and I actually learned some stuff on the way, just reading through some things and looking at things. But what I plan on doing is ultimately just talking about different cooking tips and techniques, or dining out tips and techniques that people can employ to reduce cholesterol. Reducing cholesterol is very important for reasons you outlined, but we know that it is a large contributor to heart attack and stroke, which are the #1 killer in this country. And so anything that we can do to lower cholesterol, I think, would be good. So to start off, before we even get into talking about the cooking tips, I wanted to talk about just what the different types of fats are, because I think one needs to be educated in that first before you can make proper cooking decisions and dining decisions. And so the first type to talk about are the saturated fats. The saturated fats are the main dietary cause of high cholesterol. And one way to think about what saturated fats are is to think about fats that are coming from animal products, so meats, cheeses, other dairy, milk. These are the fats that are called saturated fats, and they raise your cholesterol. There are some rare, less plant sources of saturated fat. They're not commonly ingested or eaten. Coconuts or coconut oil, palm kernel oil. These are some sources of saturated fat that come from plant sources. But by and large, when you're thinking about saturated fats, you can think about them as being derived from animal products. So that's something most people should be aware of or know what saturated fats are. And then there's a lot of other ones to talk about. Another one to talk about are the unsaturated fats. That's a likely next step, to talk about unsaturated fats. And there are different types of unsaturated fats. There are what are called monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. And what this is referring to, I guess, without getting too scientific, is these fats have a chemical chain or compound, and they have branches, and the branches can be saturated or filled up with other molecules, and that's what a saturated fat is. Or if some of those aren't filled up, that's an unsaturated fat. The two main unsaturated fats, like I said, are polyunsaturated and monounsaturated. And these are what you find in certain types of fish, nuts, seeds, certain types of oils. They're actually thought to be the good type of fat. So remember, the good fats are the unsaturated fats. When you're talking about fish, you can often see that in salmon, trout, herring, which I don't think people eat as much herring around here. Some other things that have good sources of unsaturated fats are avocado, some nuts such as walnuts and almonds, and certain oils, some of the main ones being canola oil, olive oil, I think soybean oil as well, sunflower oil. When you use these types of fats in place of saturated fats, that's the key. It's in place of, not adding on to have more and more fats, but in place of saturated fats, it can help your cholesterol profile. Moving on to talk about other types of fats, we hear about hydrogenated fat or trans fat. And one simple way to think about trans fat is that they're generally manufactured or don't occur in nature too much. Now, they can to some small degree, but what happens is during the processing of food, fats undergo a process that's called hydrogenation. And this is what you see in margarines and shortenings and such. And that hydrogenation produces a trans fat, essentially. And the trans fats are the bad ones. You find them in addition to the margarines and the shortenings. You see them in a lot of processed foods and cookies and fast foods. And why are they harmful? It's because they are known to raise cholesterol even more than saturated fats. And a lot of studies have linked them to bad outcomes with coronary disease and stroke and such. It's gotten to the point now where the FDA actually has started to require trans fat content be listed on nutrition labels, but one should note that fast food companies and restaurants aren't required to do that quite yet. So you may not notice it. Some of them will very willingly promote their food as having zero trans fat because people realize that that might be a good choice, but it can be deceiving as well.
So let me just summarize what I think that you said to make sure that I got what you explained. So you said saturated fats are from animals, and those are a big source of the way our body makes cholesterol. But you made a distinction that you said dietary source of cholesterol, but our body makes cholesterol even beyond what we eat. So there's saturated fat, so that's sort of at this level. You said a little bit better or less bad maybe is polyunsaturated fats, but really bad is this synthetic manufactured fat called trans fat. And we should really avoid those. And as a matter of fact, I think, you can confirm this, but I think the City of New York Health Department has actually outlawed it, that nobody in the City of New York, for instance, as one example, is allowed to use trans fat in restaurants in the City of New York.
That's true. Actually, I didn't even mention that, but that is absolutely true. And trans fats are sneaky. You know, I read an example of, you have a donut for breakfast, for example, that's 3 to 4 grams of trans fatty acids. Some French fries at lunch, that's another 6 to 7 grams. So right then and there, you have 10 grams of trans fatty acids, and that's way above and exceeding what is recommended by the American Heart Association.
Well, I try to be knowledgeable about this, but you've already lost me on that. So help me and the audience. What does it mean? What does it mean, 10 grams of fat? Like, what's a recommended amount of fat? Like, help me understand.
So there are these guidelines that are put forth by lots of different societies, but one is the American Heart Association, and I'll just list them. And they recommend for a healthy diet that one limit their total fat intake to 25 to 30% of their total calories for the day. So if you're taking in 2,000 calories for the day, 25 to 30% should be coming from fat. On top of that, though, there's further breakdowns here of what they should limit, and they recommend limiting your saturated fat of that to less than 7%, and trans fat should be less than 1%. That's not very much in the way of what so that donut and French fry example exceeds that quite quickly.
Well, for me, it's a very simple. The trans fat should be absolutely wiped out. You should have none. So that's the easy one. The other parts, though, we're not saying you shouldn't have fat, because fat is a critical part. No one's going to achieve this, but you can't wipe out the fat. So help us, let's just say for the purposes of our discussion, avoid trans fat at all costs, 0 if possible. Ask at your donut shop. You shouldn't be eating a lot of donuts, but do you use trans fat? But help me understand this whole saturated fat, total fat idea.
I guess one example, an example is a very typical, let's say, 40-year-old person who needs about 2,000 calories per day. And it's amazing. If one were to sit down and actually count their calories, I would be not surprised at all to see most people eating more than what their body really needs. I mean, it's not a surprise. On average, let's say a 40-year-old sedentary person who's not exercising around the clock requires about 2,000 calories per day. So if you do the math with all these percentages of that, she should consume less than 16 grams of saturated fat, less than 2 grams of trans fat. So that's where I gave the example of the donut and the fries was greater than 10 grams. So you've 4 times now higher than what you should have with the trans fat. And total fat should be 50 to 70 grams for the day. So one has to learn how to read labels in the back of packages of food and such, and know what they're consuming. And that the majority of that leaves a lot of space there. What fat should come from, and it should be coming from the unsaturated fat category. Certain types of oils, nuts, fish, seeds, things like that.
Okay. So give me some ideas about how you can reduce the amount of fat in your diet. I mean, what will help us?
Yeah, so this is what I want to spend the bulk of the time talking about, because this is, I think, this is real stuff that people can try to do at home. So first we'll talk about just how to reduce saturated fat in your meat and poultry and daily consumption. And it's amazing, just portion size alone can make a big difference. What the AHA actually recommends is that one eats no more than 6 ounces of cooked lean meat, poultry, or fish, or seafood in a day. that's not a lot compared to, I think, a lot. You go to a restaurant, people get portions that are much larger. You hear about half-pound burgers and things like that, but portions that are often much higher than that.
A quarter-pound burger would be 4 ounces.
Right.
So just to put that in perspective. So if you eat a quarter-pounder burger, that's 4 of the 6 ounces in a day.
Yep.
So you're only allowed to have 2 more ounces if you're following these recommendations.
Yeah, and that, it's hard to get a 2-ounce serving of meat,
Right.
but people often have some sort of cold cuts at lunch or something, or something. So it's pretty quick to exceed that recommendation, certainly. And one interesting way to think about this is most meats tend to have about the same amount of cholesterol. It's about 140 milligrams for every 6-ounce piece of meat. But the type of saturated fat, or the amount of saturated fat in these meats, vary greatly. And so that's what we want to talk about a little bit. So some things go without saying. So when you're picking your meats, select the lean cuts with the least amount of visible fat. So with the beef, the lean cuts are, people know, filet or tenderloin, but also chuck or sirloin or some of the leaner cuts. If you're buying a burger, you can buy it with different grades. There's 93% lean, there's 90, 85, 80, 70, it goes down, different percentages. So choose the more lean one. If you're buying pork, tenderloin or loin chops are a good choice. With lamb, the leg is usually the more, or the loin, or certainly the more lean cuts of meat. We talk about trimming all the fat away before you start to cook. Some people like to pan fry their meats. I think broiling it is a better way to do it, and broiling it on a rack where a lot of the juices can drip down. It makes a big difference as well. What else was I going to say? If you're going to baste meats and you're roasting or cooking things, maybe not using the actual fat drippings to baste it with, but maybe using wine or some other oil-based marinade might be a good way to do it. And one interesting thing I never thought about beforehand is that if you're cooking stews or soups and things like that, those can be made ahead of time. Refrigerate them. And when it chills, the fat is going to solidify. And so you can then very easily carve off or just cut away the fat, get rid of it, and when you warm the soup up, you've lost a lot of that no good fat. And I'd never really thought about that before, but that's certainly a very good strategy. Some people talk about when something calls for browned meat, instead of frying it in that way, maybe just broil it to get it's a better way of doing it. Talking about eating chicken and turkey rather than some other things, or leaner choices of protein. Removing the skin from chicken before cooking it is ideal, but if one wants to leave it there for moisture purposes, then perhaps making sure you remove the skin afterwards as well and just eat the chicken. Limiting processed meats makes a big difference. So those are things like sausages, bologna, lots of cold cuts, salamis, hot dogs. A lot of these processed meats have a fair amount of fat, even the ones that are labeled as low fat do. And a lot of them are very high in sodium. We'll talk later in the segment about sodium, but a lot of those types of meats are very high in sodium, which can be a problem as well. I don't think many people eat organ meats, but liver, sweetbread, things like that, those tend to be high in cholesterol, so avoiding that is a good thing as well.
So basically on the first part, you said to limit yourself to 6 ounces of meat per day for a normal-sized person, normal calories, is I think gets us pretty simply to having meat not even every day. I mean, it's pretty almost, you're saying that, so that for what people...
Yeah.
And one of the things that you mentioned to me off here before we talked about was that the size of a piece of meat in relation to a deck of cards. Maybe we could teach the audience that point you were making.
Yeah, I mean, that's a normal sized portion of meat is often referred to as being the size of a deck of cards. And I know when I go out to restaurants and order chicken parmesan, for example, the piece that comes is gigantic, and it's lathered with cheese, and it's a humongous portion. And so portion sizes, and it's interesting, if you look at images or pictures from the 1950s or 1960s of what was a normal size hamburger, 3 ounces, 4 ounces and now 8 ounces is often the norm at a restaurant if you go order a burger, and so it's really changed quite a bit.
Okay.
But to your point about the frequency with which you should eat meat, it's recommended actually that you choose seafood a couple times a week as a more lean choice of protein. Different cuts of fish, different types can be fatty, but it's still lower in saturated fat than the other meat choices that one make. And of course, I don't mean have fish and chips as your way of doing it. We're not going to batter it and deep fry it. You should have it baked or broiled or grilled even. Even shrimp is thought of as having a high, or shellfish thought of having high cholesterol content, but it's still better than a lot of having red meat, for example. Okay. So along the same lines, just overall just reducing the amount of meat that you eat, having meatless meals.
That's impossible. How can it possibly? What could you possibly eat if you didn't have meat? Well, give me an example.
Having meals with, well, there's lots of, with vegetables. So,
vegetables? Wow, this is outrageous.
So vegetables and beans, and no longer thinking of a meat being the main part of the meal, with the other things being a little, maybe flip it around with how much you have meat become sort of the condiment, if you will, or the side dish, if you will, might be a better approach. And
so a delicious pasta dish, for instance, would be something that might be meatless.
Yeah, right. You could do the sky's the limit what you could do. Eggplant parmesan or eggplant lasagna, or just pasta with other vegetables, vegetable primavera type of thing. Lots of different things you can do.
Okay.
I think Italian food and pasta is a real easy one to lend itself to meatless cooking. But again, getting away from the notion that the meat has to be take up half the plate, and then having a vegetable and a starch taking up the other parts of the plate. That mentality could probably deviate away from that.
Okay.
So along those lines, so then, how do you make vegetables taste good? And that's another issue. Just steaming them or boiling them is not going to get it done. And so cooking vegetables in a way that's still low fat and low salt is important, and not deep frying them and what have you. And there's lots of ways you can do this, but, adding just a touch of oil just to cook with that, whether it's a canola oil or olive oil, is a good strategy. You're now using a healthier fat, an unsaturated fat, and you're eating vegetables, and so you're replacing the saturated fat that you would have been eating beforehand. And I'm not going to go through recipes here per se, but there's lots of things people can do to make it taste good. It's about, depending on what culture you come from or what your background is and what have you. There's lots of ways to make vegetables taste good, I think.
Okay. So just talk a little bit more about how you can use vegetable oils in preparation of foods versus other kinds of fat. Like the worst kind of fat might be a saturated fat, like a Crisco type of thing. What would be like the next best and maybe the ultimate best way to cook?
Yeah, so using liquid oils certainly makes a difference versus solid fats. That's one way to think about it. The more hard and solid it is,
at room temperature, you're referring to.
Correct. Yep. Sorry. Yep. The not quite as good it is, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so we often recommend using canola. The easy canola oil and olive oil. Those are the easiest to think about. There's other ones, sunflower or safflower, but the most readily available commercially, canola and olive oil. You can get that in any store, anywhere. And those can often be used instead of solid fats. If a recipe calls for, a couple tablespoons of butter, if you're making a rice pilaf and you put a little bit of butter in there, you could certainly just put a little bit of olive, just a couple of tablespoons of olive oil in there instead. And that's a better thing to do. When making other things, such as let's say pancakes or waffles, for example, and it calls for butter in the pan or butter in there, you could substitute oils, etc. When cooking fish or poultry in a pan, again, using these types of oils is better than using butter. When you're making this is maybe deviating a little bit, making a cream sauce or certain soups that call for cream, using lower fat options such as 1% or 2% or skim milk instead of cream or half and half or full whole milk, that makes a big difference.
I see some people promote the idea that in addition to the qualitative differences you said, like of using olive oil instead of using butter or Crisco or some kind of a saturated fat, solid saturated fat, to use olive oil, but to use it in a different quantities, the way you actually coat the pan with either spraying it or instead of just dumping a fair amount in a pan. Have you any experience with that? Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, and spray is actually a nice way to minimize what you're using. A little spray just to make sure things aren't sticking if you're not looking for it to add taste or flavor to the thing. And it's a nice strategy to reduce what you're using.
Okay.
Other things that people can do sometimes, if you're making mashed potatoes, for example, instead of putting cream in there, you could put even just some of the reserved water that you boil the potato in. Often is a nice way to avoid putting milk or cream or butter in there. So those are some options that people can do. One interesting thing that people can do is instead of putting in butter, for example, if you're making, let's say, muffins or brownies or what have you, pureeing up some vegetables or fruit. And often you see in recipes using applesauce as a substitute. It's just a one-to-one substitution. And I've tried it before, and it's a subtle taste difference, but not a game breaker where you don't want to eat the dessert at all.
So applesauce substitute for butter, you're saying?
Yeah, you can really often just do a one-to-one substitution of whatever puree you want to do. I've actually seen recipes where people are recommending putting pureed or mashed up blueberries in your burger. as a way of introducing the antioxidant effect of the blueberry into the burger. And it's been served at restaurants, and people have not even noticed the difference that there's been blueberries mashed up into their burgers.
Seems like a false advertising problem there, but.
Yeah, maybe, but...
All right, well, let me ask you another question, because this is great information, and I want to get as much as we can. People ask about eggs. Tell me a little about something about eggs. What do we need to know for baking and eating eggs?
Yeah, so eggs, the issue of cholesterol in eggs, it's all in the yolk. So cholesterol is found in the yolk of the egg. Without the yolk, egg whites are actually a very good, heart-healthy source of protein. So when you have recipes that are calling for whole eggs, many of them, now you may have to experiment, but many of them come out just as good when you use just the egg white, or maybe there's also cholesterol-free egg substitutes, and one called egg beaters is an example. But generally, you could replace one whole egg with 2 egg whites. And when you're baking, though, you may want to add a little bit of oil for consistency reasons, to moisten things up a little bit. So a little canola oil, which tends to have not a lot of flavor to it to alter things. But I think it's a very reasonable strategy. Or if you're making an omelet, for example, maybe just 1 egg yolk and 2 egg whites or something as a way of reducing the amount of...
And in terms of what you've learned, just to help me, how important or how big a bang for my buck is this change? Just what you just described, using 2 egg whites with the little canola oil. I'm guessing that the change of eating less meat, less saturated fat, wiping out trans fat have a big impact.
Yes.
Where would you put this? Just below that, or a lot below? Like, is this a long run for a short slide? Kind of
no,
thing?
I don't think so. And I don't have, to be honest with you, I don't have the exact number of how much cholesterol is in an egg yolk. Do you know that off the top of your head?
I don't know.
No, I don't know off the top of my head. I think it's overall, though, just lifestyle change in general. So doing all the little things adds up.
Okay.
That it's not just one thing of, well, I'm going to stop eating red meat every night. That'd be a huge intervention, but it's all the little things add up to, I think, do a lot of good. And so I think... I think it's a useful thing to do.
Okay.
I'm not saying that you got to eat, steamed brown rice and boiled vegetables every night. There's just alternative strategies that will work for you.
I mean, I appreciate your comment, but the nature of my questions, I'm sure you could appreciate, was we want to get as much as we can, and sometimes by presenting a lot to a patient, they want to do nothing. So I think you answered it well.
Yeah, I mean, right, for sure. If you're going to make little changes and chip away at things, then absolutely. If you're a meat and potatoes kind of person, you're eating red meat every night or 3 nights a week, and making that change is a big thing. It's hard to undo habits of 50, 60 years. I understand that, but it's important. Okay,
so another question that comes up with our patients, this whole thing about milk. We have milk that's whole milk, 2%, 1%, skim. I had a patient who told me he used to have a cereal every morning with half and half.
Wow.
Is that something worth making a change?
Absolutely, I think. I mean, if you read the content of these things, fat, if you read labels, it's a big difference when you're taking whole milk versus skim milk, which is a fat-free product. So I would encourage people to, as much as they can, use skim milk. Now, if the taste just drives you crazy, then maybe 1% might be a way to go. And I think a lot of recipes, you might not be able to really tell the difference. If it's calling for whole milk or cream or half and half, just ratcheting it down a little bit to either 2% or 1% or skim, you might have to experiment. Certain recipes or certain things might just not work for you, but I think when you can minimize it, it makes sense. And also there's other things. You can get low-fat cottage cheeses or part-skim mozzarellas or ricottas, low-fat cheeses. And when you're making something like, let's say, a lasagna, I think it's hard to tell the difference when you're using a part-skim mozzarella versus a non-part-skim mozzarella. So you can make changes, I think.
Okay. So one question that comes up sometimes is the question about whether fiber makes a difference. What's the story with fiber in our diet?
Yeah, so increasing fiber and whole grains is a good thing, generally speaking. There's a lot of things it can do, but one thing it also promotes is satiety and being full and not wanting to eat more and more. And that's a useful thing, but it's also heart healthy. So there's a lot of strategies that you can do to increase your fiber or your whole grain intake. If you're going to make a stuffing or croutons or you can use whole grain bread and crush that up or grind that up to make your breadcrumbs. Certainly you could do that. One interesting thing that I've never thought of before but I read was for making a meatloaf, instead of putting breadcrumbs in there, using oatmeal, just uncooked oatmeal. And I'm going to try that, actually. I'd be curious to see what the taste is like, but that's another way of introducing certain grains into the meal. Instead of drinking fruit juice, which is not bad, but actually eating the whole fruit introduces a lot more fiber into one's diet, and using brown rice instead of white rice. One strategy, too, actually, if you're making a rice that's very flavorful with other spices, you're making a Spanish rice or other types of things, where ordinarily you might not like brown rice, maybe it'd be more palatable to you when you're putting all these other spices in there and spicing it up. So that's one strategy. Whole grain pasta, same thing. If you're spicing it up with a lot of other things, maybe you could try that instead. Just colorful vegetables, carrots, broccoli, cauliflower, parsnips, these other things are a good way of introducing fiber into one's diet.
Okay, so we're running out of time, but I want to get one last question that comes up frequently. And this is the way that comes up in my conversation with patients is, 20 years ago when I had my heart attack, they told me to switch from butter to margarine. And then afterwards they said margarine was bad. So that's it. I'm not listening to you guys anymore. It's all crazy. And what I think happened was it was well-intentioned to move from saturated fats to unsaturated fats, but we didn't really understand the trans fat acid issue that you've now taught us about, that we've now learned that trans fats are bad, and some margarines had trans fats.
Yes.
So is that really the story, or tell us the difference?
The devil's
in
in the details. I mean, so you could, if you want to put a hierarchy here.
Yeah, I would love that.
Certain types of margarines are the best when you're trying to pick a margarine or a butter, but not all margarines are the same. And certain ones are more hydrogenated than others, more trans fat there than others, and that's the key. Butter is an animal product. It's rich in saturated fat, so that's a less, you don't want that as much. So the one way to read the labels is to look for a margarine with the lowest trans fat content and less than 2 grams of total saturated fat plus trans fat. There's not a lot out there. You have to really kind of pick, and the tub margarine's better than the solid stick margarine as well. The more solid one is, the more likely.
That's a theme from earlier. Solid is worse.
Yes, it's more hydrogenated, more trans. So one brand that is consistently written about as being a good source is Smart Balance Light. That's one and there's a couple others I think. Promise is another one that is written about as being a pretty good one. But it really comes down to reading the label, because there's so many choices. You stand there in front of the refrigerator section, so many choices. But certain types of the caveat: certain types of margarines are better than butter, but not all margarines are the same. But in general, if you're trying to use a fat for something, using an unsaturated fat like canola or olive is a better option. And now there's products out there that mix certain types of margarines with canola oil or with vegetable oil as well, and that's pretty good too.
Okay. So but the caveat there also too, we again go back to that quantity thing. If you use a ton of margarine, you've negated the benefit of a small amount of butter as another option.
That's true.
So that's another option to consider, is reducing the quantity. Wow, what a tour de force. Thank you, Dr. Sunny Srivastava, for a great review of some bunch of topics that come up in my home, but also in my office talking to patients. I'm excited about having this information available for patients to review and think about, and we look forward to continuing this discussion about this aspect of heart health and strategies of both eating and cooking for our patients. Until next time, I'm Seth Bilazarian from Matters of the Heart. Thank you.